The flight from Chicago to San Francisco was packed, and the tension was already mounting. Passengers shuffled into their seats, but one woman stood out, her every movement demanding attention. Her name, Linda, echoed as she barked orders at the flight attendants, and it was clear she expected the world to cater to her whims. Dressed in designer clothes and draped in sparkling jewelry, she looked around with disdain, her eyes narrowing at the slightest imperfection. Ethan Cole noticed her immediately. As an undercover FBI agent, he was used to blending in, yet today felt different. He wore jeans and a simple shirt, hoping to pass as just another passenger. But he knew, all too well, the look on Linda's face as she spotted him, a flash of contempt, an assumption as sharp as it was unspoken. It was a look that said, "People like you don't belong here." Her glare hardened, eyes filled with judgment, as if his presence alone disrupted her world. Ethan took a deep breath, bracing himself. This was only the beginning. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, let's get started. Linda's disapproval didn't take long to escalate. As the flight attendants moved through the aisle, she waved one over with an impatient snap of her fingers. "Excuse me," she began, her voice sharp. "I specifically requested sparkling water. This, whatever this is," she held up her cup with a look of pure disgust, "is unacceptable. I paid for first-class service, not whatever this airline thinks it can get away with." The young flight attendant managed a polite smile, explaining that the airline had run out of sparkling water but could offer another drink instead. But Linda scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Typical. Can't expect much better these days, can you?" She muttered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, her eyes darting briefly toward Ethan, who sat quietly in his seat. He tried to focus on his book, but Linda's voice continued to cut through the cabin. Then, as if suddenly realizing he was there, Linda's eyes fixed on Ethan with a calculated coldness. She leaned forward, her gaze hardening. "Excuse me," she sneered, waving her hand as if to shoo him back, though he wasn't even close to her. "You need to sit down and stop crowding the aisle." Ethan looked up, startled. He wasn't in the aisle. He was just stretching his legs slightly beside his seat. He met her eyes calmly and replied, "Ma'am, I'm not in the aisle. I'll be sitting back down in a moment." But Linda's lips curled in disdain, and she let out a huff. "I know how people like you are. Always thinking you can take up space wherever you want. This isn't your neighborhood, so act accordingly," she snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. The phrase, "people like you," hung heavy in the air, and Ethan felt a pang of anger. He had been through enough situations to know where this was headed. But on an airplane, confined and surrounded by dozens of silent witnesses, it felt different. As her words lingered, he could sense the discomfort in the passengers around them, eyes flickering between the two as whispers began to spread. Linda continued, undeterred by the silence she'd created. "I paid a lot for this seat, and I'm not about to have my flight ruined by someone who doesn't even belong in this section." She glared at him, her eyes full of unwarranted resentment. "I don't know how someone like you even got on this flight, but maybe someone should check your ticket. Or better yet, your background." Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to take a steadying breath. He'd dealt with racists before, but it was never easy. "I'm just here to fly like everyone else, ma'am," he said, his tone calm but firm, hoping to de-escalate the situation. "Let's keep things civil." Linda's eyes narrowed further. "Oh, that's rich. People like you always try to act like victims, don't you?" She scoffed, looking around for support from other passengers. "I know exactly what you're doing. Pretending to be all polite, trying to make me look like the bad guy. But I'm not stupid." Some of the other passengers shifted uncomfortably, looking down or away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Yet no one spoke up. The flight attendants, too, were lingering nearby, clearly hesitant to intervene in what had rapidly become a volatile situation. Ethan knew he needed to stay composed. As an FBI agent, he'd been trained to handle high-pressure situations, and he knew responding with anger wouldn't help. but it was difficult to ignore the blatant prejudice and the public humiliation. His pulse quickened as he reminded himself of the values he held, and the reality of his position. He represented more than just himself here. He had to stay calm, to show dignity even when faced with such open disrespect. Just as he thought things might settle, Linda turned her attention back to him, her tone even more hostile. "Why don't you just admit it? You probably don't even belong in this country." She spat out, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. The weight of her words hit like a punch, the air in the cabin growing thick with tension. Ethan felt his hands clench at his sides, the anger simmering beneath his calm facade. A few passengers began to murmur, visibly uncomfortable now, some whispering among themselves. Ethan could sense the eyes on him, some sympathetic, others simply curious. Yet still, no one intervened. Linda's voice rang out again, louder this time, addressing the passengers around her. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You let one of them on the plane, and suddenly, it's like they think they own the place. Someone needs to put him in his place." Her words dripped with a venom that left a bitter silence in its wake. Ethan held her gaze, determined not to give her the reaction she wanted. But inside, he couldn't deny the growing frustration. Here he was, just a man trying to travel in peace, yet once again reduced to a target because of prejudice. It was a painful reminder that no matter his rank, his job, or his accomplishments, there were people who saw him as less than just because of his skin. And Linda, with her entitled sneer and baseless accusations, seemed determined to provoke him further. Ethan took a deep, steadying breath, doing everything in his power to maintain control. Years of FBI training had prepared him to handle volatile situations with professionalism and patience, yet there was something uniquely challenging about this confrontation. He wasn't facing a dangerous criminal. He was up against someone whose weapon was pure prejudice. But he knew, from experience, that a response, any response, could be exactly what Linda was looking for. A flight attendant approached, clearly unsettled by the tension. "Ma'am, is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice polite but strained. Linda immediately launched into her tirade, gesturing dramatically toward Ethan. "No, everything is not okay," she exclaimed. "I don't feel safe with him sitting so close. People like him are always causing trouble." Her voice carried, ensuring that everyone nearby heard her accusations. The attendant looked at Ethan apologetically, but hesitated, clearly uncertain about how to handle the situation. This was no ordinary passenger complaint. Linda's words held a venomous edge that made even seasoned crew members wary of intervening too forcefully. Ethan felt a pang of frustration but remained silent, watching as the attendant struggled with how to proceed. Around him, he could feel the passengers' discomfort, some casting sympathetic glances his way, while others simply avoided eye contact, unsure of how to react. Then, a voice broke the silence. "Lady, you need to stop," said a tall man seated across the aisle. His tone was firm, his expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. "You're the only one here causing a problem." He looked over at Ethan and gave a slight nod, as if to offer a silent gesture of support. But Linda wasn't about to back down. She turned on the man, her face twisted in indignation. "Excuse me? Who do you think you are? You don't know what I've had to deal with, sitting here feeling unsafe." Her voice rose with each word, drawing more attention as passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances. The man shook his head, clearly unimpressed. "Unsafe? You're sitting on a plane surrounded by dozens of people, and you're harassing this man for no reason. You're making a fool of yourself." Several passengers nodded in agreement, some murmuring their support. It was clear that Linda's outburst was wearing on everyone's patience. But rather than heed their reactions, she only seemed to grow angrier, crossing her arms and glaring at Ethan with even more contempt. "Oh, now you're all against me?" she snapped, her voice filled with incredulity. "I'm the only one here with enough guts to say what everyone else is thinking. People like him are always causing issues. You all just don't see it." Ethan kept his eyes forward, refusing to engage. But inside, he felt the weight of Linda's words sinking deeper. Every insult, Every assumption, each one felt like a wound, raw and exposed under the scrutiny of a silent audience. He had fought his way into the FBI, overcoming doubts and prejudices, proving himself time and again. And yet here he was, reduced to a stereotype, a target for someone's unfounded hatred. A young woman a few rows up turned to the flight attendant, her voice shaking with frustration. "Are you going to do something about this?" she asked. "This is getting way out of hand." The attendant, visibly flustered, nodded and took a step toward Linda. "Ma'am, please lower your voice," the attendant said firmly. "You're causing a disturbance, and if this continues, we may have to involve the captain." Linda scoffed, clearly unbothered. She threw up her hands, her expression one of pure indignation. "Oh, so now I'm the bad guy? For standing up for my safety?" She turned to the passengers around her, trying to rally support. "This is the problem with this country. People like him think they can do whatever they want, and everyone else just looks the other way." The attendant's patience was clearly wearing thin, but she maintained her professionalism. "Ma'am, please sit down and allow everyone to enjoy the rest of the flight peacefully. This behavior is unacceptable." Linda looked as if she might explode. Her face flushed red, her hands clenched into fists as she glared down at Ethan, her voice dripping with condescension. "Unbelievable. They'll let anyone on planes these days, won't they?" She spat, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. The man who had spoken up earlier shook his head, clearly disgusted. "You're just making it worse for yourself, lady," he muttered, loud enough for Linda to hear. "No one here agrees with you." Ethan felt a surge of gratitude for the support, however quiet, of the other passengers. It was a small comfort in an otherwise hostile situation, but it reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone. He took another calming breath, grounding himself amidst the tension, knowing that his composure was his strength. Yet Linda was far from finished. She leaned into the aisle, her eyes narrowing as she stared him down. "I bet you think you're above everyone here, don't you? Sitting there all smug, thinking you can do whatever you want." Her voice was icy, each word laced with disdain. "I'm sure you've never had to follow the rules a day in your life." Ethan met her gaze steadily, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm just trying to get to my destination, same as you," he replied. "I suggest we leave it at that." Linda's lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, you'd like that, wouldn't you? Playing the innocent card, pretending you're just here minding your own business. I've seen your type before, always thinking you're above everyone else, never respecting boundaries." The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point, the quiet murmurs growing louder as more passengers took notice. Even the flight attendants seemed uncertain, caught between maintaining order and not wanting to escalate the confrontation further. A middle-aged woman sitting nearby leaned over to her husband, her voice a whisper but audible in the quiet cabin. "This is ridiculous. I've never seen anything like it. The poor man hasn't done a thing." The flight attendant, sensing that the situation was spiraling, leaned closer to Linda and spoke in a quiet but firm tone. "Ma'am, this is the last time I'm going to ask you to please return to your seat and stop harassing other passengers. We're here to ensure everyone's safety and comfort, and this behavior is either." Linda's face flushed with anger, but for a moment she seemed to hesitate. She glanced around, taking in the disapproving looks from the other passengers, the flight attendant's steely gaze, and the man across the aisle who hadn't stopped frowning at her. But then she crossed her arms defiantly, muttering under her breath, "This isn't over. People like him never know their place." Ethan felt the sting of her words but didn't react. He reminded himself once again why he was here, why he needed to stay composed. He was an FBI agent, trained to handle high-stress situations. And while he'd faced danger far more severe than this, nothing quite matched the raw, personal pain of being singled out and demeaned for something he couldn't change. Around him, the murmurs of disapproval grew louder. A man a few rows back shook his head in disbelief, whispering to his wife, "Unbelievable. This kind of behavior, in this day and age." Ethan took a steady breath, willing himself to focus on the flight ahead, on his purpose, on anything but the venomous accusations still hanging in the air. This wasn't over, he could sense it. But for now, he held his ground, refusing to let Linda's hate define his worth. Linda's anger simmered, but her determination to assert dominance didn't wane. She cast a glance around the cabin, clearly dissatisfied with the other passengers' sympathetic looks toward Ethan. Her mouth twisted in disdain as she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. People like him always think they can get away with anything. Unbelievable. Ethan sat quietly, willing himself to focus anywhere but on Linda's pointed glares. He could feel the weight of her hostility pressing down on him, a force all too familiar. Yet he kept his composure, knowing that any response might only make things worse. But Linda wasn't about to let things go. She leaned forward, tilting her head with a sneer. "Look at you," she whispered venomously. "Sitting there all high and mighty, acting like you're better than everyone else here. I bet you think you're special, don't you?" Ethan said nothing, but inside he felt a pang, a familiar sting that no amount of experience could dull. Her words, laced with prejudice, cut deep, especially when voiced so openly and publicly. He could see passengers shifting uncomfortably, glancing his way, and he reminded himself that staying calm was his best course. Yet he sensed it. Linda was just getting started. Just when the cabin began to settle, Linda's chair scraped loudly as she stood up, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Her expression was one of outrage mixed with self-righteousness. She pointed a trembling finger toward Ethan, her voice louder and filled with accusation. "This man," she announced, ensuring everyone could hear, "shouldn't even be on this plane. I don't feel safe sitting near someone like him." Ethan remained seated, holding her gaze calmly, though the intensity of her words left him clenching his fists under his tray table. The cabin fell into a stunned silence, and even the ambient hum of the engines seemed to fade as passengers turned, eyes wide with disbelief. Linda continued undeterred by the collective discomfort. "Who knows what he's carrying? Or if he even went through security like the rest of us." Her voice was laced with an irrational edge, as if she truly believed her own accusations. "I'm telling you, this man is a threat. We deserve to know who we're sitting with." The implication was clear, and it hit Ethan like a blow. Her accusations weren't about him as a person, they were about her assumptions, her ingrained biases. She was painting him as a danger solely because of his appearance, his very existence challenging her distorted sense of order. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering in disbelief, others casting sympathetic looks at Ethan, who remained silent, determined not to let her words provoke him. A murmur rose among the passengers, rippling through the cabin. People began to exchange uneasy looks, some visibly uncomfortable with Linda's outburst. Then, the tall man who had defended Ethan earlier turned to face her again, his voice steady but firm. "Ma'am, that's enough," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're the only one here acting out of line. This man hasn't done anything to you." Linda scoffed, crossing her arms defiantly. "You don't know what people like him are capable of," she shot back, her voice laced with disdain. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." Another passenger, a woman seated a few rows ahead, turned around, her expression one of clear disapproval. "Actually, no one else here is thinking that," she retorted, shaking her head. "We're all trying to have a peaceful flight. You're the one causing a scene." Linda's face flushed, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't quite process the pushback. She looked around, expecting support, but was met with faces of frustration and disbelief. Whispers of agreement echoed down the aisle as more passengers nodded, some even muttering, "She needs to sit down." Ethan felt a surge of gratitude for the people around him. In a space where silence could have been an easy option, these strangers had chosen to stand against prejudice. It was a small but powerful reminder that decency could still prevail, even when bigotry tried to cast a shadow. For a moment, Linda seemed at a loss, stunned by the lack of support. But her anger only simmered further, her gaze hardening as she glanced back at Ethan. Seeing the tension escalating, a flight attendant stepped forward, her voice calm but assertive. She looked directly at Linda, clearly trying to keep the peace. Ma'am, she began, maintaining a professional tone. I'm going to have to ask you to sit down and respect the other passengers. We're all here to have a safe and comfortable flight. Linda's eyes narrowed, the outrage in her expression intensifying. Are you seriously ignoring my concerns? She demanded, her voice rising again. I'm telling you, I don't feel safe with him on board. He should be checked, or better yet, removed. The flight attendant kept her composure, though her patience was visibly strained. Ma'am, there is absolutely no reason to question this passenger's right to be here. He has every bit as much right to fly as you do. Her voice remained steady, but there was a firmness that made it clear she wouldn't tolerate further disruptions. Linda glared at the attendant, her fists clenched, clearly furious at being challenged. The other passengers watched in tense silence, hoping the situation would finally de-escalate. Linda huffed, crossing her arms as she looked around the cabin, still hoping to find someone who might agree with her. But all she met were looks of annoyance and disappointment. Realizing she was alone in her outburst, her indignation gave way, if only slightly. She let out a loud, frustrated sigh, then reluctantly lowered herself back into her seat, her movements stiff and resentful. As she sat, Linda muttered under her breath, her voice dripping with contempt. This isn't over, she hissed, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. People like him always think they can get away with anything. Ridiculous. Ethan felt her words like tiny barbs, each one meant to provoke him. But he kept his focus straight ahead, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Around him, the cabin finally began to settle, passengers visibly relaxing now that Linda had backed down. Yet the tension still lingered, the air thick with the unease her words had stirred up. For the moment, Linda was silent. But Ethan sensed this temporary quiet wouldn't last long. Ethan sat still, focusing on his breath, grounding himself in the moment. He knew better than anyone that responding with anger would only escalate the situation further. Years of training had taught him restraint, especially in moments when it felt most challenging. But as Linda's whispered insults lingered in the air, each one more pointed than the last, he felt the old, familiar ache of frustration. Here he was, an FBI agent who had spent his life serving and protecting, reduced, in her eyes, to nothing more than a threat based solely on the color of his skin. He reminded himself to stay calm. He wasn't just representing himself, he was representing countless others who'd faced the same prejudice. He knew that his composure was his power, that his dignity was a shield against her ignorance. So he closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the hum of the engines ground him, ignoring Linda's glares. But Linda wasn't finished. Only a few minutes after sitting down, she stood up once again, this time looking around the cabin as if rallying others to join her. This is unbelievable, she declared loudly, eyes blazing. Why is everyone just sitting there? Do none of you care about safety? A few passengers exchanged confused looks, unsure of what she was getting at. Linda, catching sight of the flight attendant, beckoned her over with a furious wave. This man, she said, gesturing accusingly toward Ethan, needs to show some ID. I want to know if he's even supposed to be on this flight. For all we know, he could be dangerous. Ethan's stomach tightened, though he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. This was beyond insulting. It was an outright accusation, an attempt to humiliate him publicly. But he knew deep down that this wasn't about him personally. It was about her ignorance, her unwillingness to see past her own biases. The flight attendant approached, looking weary but maintaining her professionalism. Ma'am, she said firmly, we don't ask passengers for ID once they're on board. Everyone here has already been through security. Linda's face twisted with rage. So you're just going to ignore my concerns? She demanded, her voice escalating. You don't know who he is. People like him shouldn't be allowed on flights without proper checks. It's common sense. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle over him, heavy and suffocating. People like him. That phrase, so casually thrown around, carried a world of prejudice. But instead of letting her words shake him, he took a deep breath and reminded himself of who he was, of everything he'd achieved despite people like Linda doubting him. Just then, a figure emerged from the front of the plane, the pilot, his face serious as he approached. The passengers fell silent, their eyes following his every step. The pilot stopped beside Linda, looking her directly in the eye. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Russell." He introduced himself calmly, but there was an unmistakable authority in his voice. "I understand there's a concern here?" Linda nodded vigorously, her indignation returning with renewed force. "Yes. I've been saying this whole time that I don't feel safe with this man on board. I'm simply asking for him to prove he's supposed to be here. For everyone's safety." Captain Russell held her gaze, unfazed by her demands. "Ma'am, let me be very clear. Every passenger on this plane has gone through security. This man has every right to be here, and no one deserves to be treated with the disrespect you've shown." Linda's face flushed with shock, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to form a response. She hadn't expected such a direct confrontation, least of all from the pilot himself. The captain continued, his voice steady. "This is your final warning. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we will have to take action. That could mean landing this plane and having you escorted off. Do I make myself clear?" A hush fell over the cabin as everyone waited for Linda's reaction. Her face had gone pale, the confidence drained from her as she took in the pilot's words. She looked around, perhaps hoping for support, but every gaze she met was cold, distant, tired of her antics. Finally, realizing she had no allies left, she gave a curt nod, her voice barely a whisper. "Fine. I'll sit down." The captain nodded. "Thank you, ma'am. And let's keep it that way for the rest of the flight." Linda lowered herself into her seat, arms crossed tightly, her expression one of simmering resentment. But for the first time since the ordeal began, she was silent. The tension in the cabin eased as passengers exchanged relieved glances, grateful for the peace. As Captain Russell returned to the cockpit, the flight attendants resumed their duties, moving quietly through the aisles. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the past hour lift slightly. The looks of sympathy and support from fellow passengers reminded him that, despite people like Linda, there were still those who valued decency and respect. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy silence. Ethan kept his gaze forward, avoiding Linda's occasional glances, refusing to let her rob him of his dignity. He had endured, just as he always had, and once again proved to himself that no amount of hate could define his worth. But even as he sat in the quiet, he couldn't ignore the sadness beneath his calm facade. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who faced the same judgment every day. He knew that the fight against prejudice was far from over, but today, with the support of those who spoke up, he felt a small victory, a reminder that change, however slow, was possible. As the plane taxied to a stop at San Francisco International Airport, a collective sense of relief filled the cabin. Passengers began to unbuckle their seatbelts and reach for their belongings, ready to leave behind the tension that had shadowed the flight. But for Linda, the end of the flight wasn't the end of her campaign. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, she shot out of her seat, her eyes zeroing in on Ethan. Ignoring the disapproving glances from those around her, she flagged down a flight attendant with a wave that was almost accusatory. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud and sharp enough to cut through the rustle of passengers gathering their things. She jabbed a finger in Ethan's direction, her face twisted with indignation. "I want him checked by security before he leaves this plane." The flight attendant, visibly weary from handling Linda's earlier outbursts, approached cautiously. "Ma'am, please remain calm. There's no need for—" "No need?" Linda interrupted, her voice escalating as her frustration boiled over. "I told you already, I don't feel safe with him here. Who knows what he's hiding?" She glanced around the cabin, hoping to rally support, but most passengers only looked away or exchanged uncomfortable glances. Linda pressed on, seemingly oblivious to their reactions. "I mean, what kind of security does this airline have if they're letting people like him board without a proper check?" The flight attendant took a deep breath, her professional demeanor strained but intact. "Ma'am," she began, her tone firm but controlled. All passengers go through the same security screening before boarding. There's no reason to suspect anyone. Linda scoffed, folding her arms and planting her feet firmly, refusing to budge. That's not enough for me. You all saw how he acted. He thinks he can just sit there and ignore everyone like he's above us. I don't know where he comes from, but where I come from, people respect the rules. A murmur ran through the cabin as other passengers, visibly uncomfortable, shook their heads or whispered among themselves. Some cast sympathetic glances at Ethan, who remained seated, his expression calm but resolute. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing at Ethan, then back at Linda. It was clear she didn't want to indulge Linda's demands, but her professional instincts won out. "All right, ma'am," she replied, though her tone carried a note of exasperation. "I'll inform airport security of your concerns." Linda's face brightened, a smug look of satisfaction crossing her features. She nodded as if finally getting what she deserved. "Good," she said, her tone dripping with self-righteousness. "Someone has to ensure we're safe. And it's about time someone does their job." The flight attendant gave her a polite but strained nod, then stepped toward the cockpit to alert the captain and arrange for security to meet the plane. Linda, feeling triumphant, settled back into her seat but continued to mutter, ensuring anyone nearby could hear. "People like him think they can do whatever they want. Not on my watch," she whispered, glancing around, almost daring someone to disagree with her. A young woman nearby shook her head in disgust, muttering to her companion, "Unbelievable. I can't believe she's actually going through with this." Linda, catching the woman's words, shot her an icy glare. "Excuse me, young lady," she said in a condescending tone. "You might not understand, but I'm only doing this to protect us all. Some people are just too naive to see the risks." The young woman raised an eyebrow, unafraid to meet Linda's glare. "No, some people just don't judge others based on appearances. Maybe you should try it." Linda huffed, clearly taken aback, and looked away, crossing her arms tightly. She continued to cast occasional glances at Ethan, her eyes cold and judgmental, as if he were somehow responsible for the discomfort in the cabin. Ethan, however, remained calm, reminding himself of the importance of staying composed. He'd seen this kind of behavior before, but that didn't make it any easier to endure. As the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign blinked off, passengers began standing, stretching, and reaching for their bags. But for Linda, the end of the flight marked the start of her crusade. She sprang from her seat, casting a triumphant look around the cabin as though preparing to lead a charge. Her eyes narrowed on Ethan, who sat calmly, waiting for the aisle to clear. Determined to have the last word, Linda flagged down a flight attendant with an urgent wave, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs of tired passengers. "Excuse me. I want him checked by security before he leaves this plane," she declared, her voice rising as she jabbed a finger in Ethan's direction. The flight attendant, visibly exhausted from dealing with Linda's earlier complaints, hesitated. "Ma'am, please calm down. I assure you there's no need." "No need?" Linda's voice rose another notch, turning heads nearby. "I told you, I don't feel safe with him here. Who knows what he's hiding?" She paused, scanning the faces around her, clearly hoping to recruit supporters. But passengers merely looked away, some even shaking their heads. "I mean, what kind of security does this airline have if they're letting people like him board without a proper check?" She continued, undeterred by the lack of response. Her words were heavy with insinuation, her tone laced with contempt. The flight attendant took a steadying breath, keeping her professional composure intact. "Ma'am," she said, her tone firm but restrained, "all passengers go through the same security screening before boarding. There's no reason to suspect anyone." Linda scoffed, crossing her arms with a defiant expression. "That's not enough for me. You all saw how he acted, sitting there like he owns the place. I don't know where he comes from, but where I come from, people respect the rules." A few passengers exchanged exasperated glances. A woman nearby leaned over to her husband, whispering, "This is just ridiculous. Another man sighed, muttering, "Unbelievable," under his breath as he shook his head. Ethan remained seated, calm but vigilant, fully aware of the weight of her words. He had heard them all before, just in different forms. But here, in the small confines of the cabin, with the eyes of dozens of people on him, the experience felt suffocating. He reminded himself to breathe, focusing on the steady rhythm, refusing to let her bait him. Linda, undeterred, continued, "Honestly, it's just common sense. Anyone with eyes can see that he doesn't belong here. We can't just ignore safety because some people don't want to face the facts." Her voice dripped with self-righteousness, as if she were performing a public service. The flight attendant's patience was clearly wearing thin, but she nodded with forced politeness. "All right, ma'am," she replied. "I'll inform airport security that you have a concern." She stepped toward the cockpit to relay Linda's demands, a hint of frustration visible in her tightened shoulders. A satisfied smirk spread across Linda's face as she watched the flight attendant walk away. She looked around at the other passengers, lifting her chin as if expecting their gratitude. "Someone has to ensure we're safe," she muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "It's about time someone does their job." An uncomfortable silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the rustling of passengers adjusting their belongings. Most people avoided eye contact with Linda, their faces a mixture of disbelief and irritation. A young woman in the row behind Ethan whispered to her friend, "She's seriously going through with this? Unreal." Linda, overhearing, turned sharply to face the young woman. "You're too young to understand real safety concerns," she snapped. "This isn't about being nice, it's about keeping everyone safe. People like him don't follow the rules, and that's how trouble starts." The young woman's eyes flashed with anger. "No, some people just don't judge others based on appearances. Maybe you should try it." Linda huffed, clearly taken aback, and quickly turned away, crossing her arms as she waited, a smug look of satisfaction creeping back onto her face. She stole glances at Ethan, her eyes glinting with a sense of self-righteous triumph, as though she were finally exposing some hidden danger. Moments later, 2 uniformed security officers entered the plane, their expressions polite but firm as they scanned the cabin. Linda's face lit up with satisfaction. She pointed directly at Ethan, practically pushing her way toward the front of the line as she announced, "There! That's him!" Her voice was loud, intended for everyone to hear. "He's the one I told you about. I don't feel safe with him on this flight." The officers exchanged a quick glance, momentarily taken aback by her forcefulness. They approached Ethan with measured steps, their posture calm but attentive. The taller of the two spoke first, his tone respectful. "Sir, may we speak with you for a moment?" Ethan nodded, his face calm and collected, though he felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. This wasn't the first time he'd faced baseless suspicion, but the public nature of it made the experience all the more exhausting. Linda hovered nearby, clearly eager to witness the exchange. "Finally," she muttered, her tone dripping with condescension. "It's about time someone took responsibility." Ignoring her, the officer continued, "Sir, we were informed of a concern raised during the flight. We'd just like to verify a few details to ensure everything is in order." Ethan met the officer's gaze, his calm demeanor unbroken. "Of course, officer," he replied smoothly. "I completely understand." Linda's face radiated satisfaction as she watched the officers speak with Ethan. "See? This is what should have happened from the start. People like him think they can do whatever they want, without consequences." One of the other passengers, an elderly man seated a few rows back, shook his head in dismay. He whispered to his wife, "This is wrong. He hasn't done a thing." His wife nodded, a look of empathy crossing her face as she watched the scene unfold. The officer maintained his professional tone. "Thank you, sir. We just need to verify your identification, and you'll be free to go." Linda leaned in, clearly delighted. She looked around, expecting others to validate her actions. "It's common sense, really," she said loudly. "You can't be too careful these days." Ethan nodded, reaching calmly into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the badge inside, a reminder of his role, his training, and everything he stood for. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on him, being subjected to scrutiny by someone who knew nothing about him, all because of her assumptions. He took a steadying breath, ready for what came next. Linda stood a few feet away, her face flushed with satisfaction as she watched the interaction unfold. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, barely able to contain her smug expression. In her mind, this was exactly the outcome she'd fought for, and now, with security involved, she felt validated, even triumphant. She glanced around the cabin, hoping to catch approving nods or at least acknowledgement from the other passengers, but most people avoided her gaze, some even looking away in embarrassment. Still, Linda didn't seem to notice the lack of support. She leaned closer to a woman nearby and muttered just loud enough for others to hear. "This is what happens when people refuse to take safety seriously. It's about time someone did something." The woman beside her shifted uncomfortably, her expression unreadable as she listened to Linda's whispered commentary. "It's nothing personal," Linda continued, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "But you can never be too careful these days. I mean, he could be anyone." Linda's words hung heavily in the air, her voice a constant reminder of her deep-seated prejudice. She truly believed she was performing a public service, protecting everyone from a threat only she seemed to perceive. To her, this moment was proof of her vigilance, a victory against an imagined danger. As the security officers continued speaking with Ethan, Linda observed every movement, her eyes fixed on them with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She practically radiated self-satisfaction, as if she had orchestrated some kind of heroic intervention. "See?" she muttered to no one in particular, her voice triumphant. "If I hadn't spoken up, who knows what could have happened? People just don't understand what's at stake." A few rows back, another passenger shook his head in quiet disapproval, clearly disturbed by Linda's behavior. He whispered to his companion, "I can't believe she's enjoying this. The poor man hasn't done a thing." Linda, overhearing the comment, shot him a dismissive look. "Ignorance," she said sharply, her voice low but scornful. "Some people just don't get it. I'm only doing what's necessary." She gave a curt nod, reaffirming her own sense of righteousness. As Ethan handed his identification to the officers, Linda tilted her head, trying to catch a glimpse of his information. She was practically leaning forward, her curiosity mingling with a hunger to confirm her assumptions. She'd already decided who Ethan was and what he represented in her mind, and she was eager for any detail that would justify her unfounded fears. The officers, maintaining their professionalism, blocked her view, keeping the conversation with Ethan private. But Linda continued her one-sided commentary, barely able to contain her excitement. "I'm sure this will confirm what I suspected," she murmured with a self-assured smirk. "People like him are always up to something. Just look at how calm he is, like he thinks he's above all of us. It's infuriating." She looked around once more, hoping someone might finally echo her sentiments, but the other passengers continued to avoid her gaze. Some looked down, pretending not to hear her, while others simply stared ahead, visibly uncomfortable. Linda, however, seemed blissfully unaware of their reactions, too wrapped up in her own conviction. The flight attendant who had been handling the situation glanced over at Linda, her face betraying a hint of impatience. She knew the true nature of Linda's behavior but kept her professionalism intact. She approached Linda cautiously, her voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, please let the officers do their job without interference." Linda huffed, clearly taken aback by the suggestion that she was interfering. "Interfering?" she replied, indignant. "I'm just making sure everyone is safe here. Someone has to." The flight attendant didn't respond, simply nodded and returned to her duties, leaving Linda to stew in her own self-righteousness. Linda's satisfaction, however, remained unshaken. She continued to watch Ethan and the officers, convinced that her actions were justified. This, to her, was a public service, a necessary intervention in an otherwise oblivious world. As Ethan handed back his ID, Linda's eyes glinted with the certainty that something incriminating would come to light. As the officer examined Ethan's identification, he paused, his eyes widening slightly as he registered the credentials before him. Ethan's calm, steady gaze held as he allowed the realization to dawn on those around him. The officer's demeanor shifted immediately, from one of polite caution to one of respect. He cleared his throat and handed the ID back with a nod, now fully aware of the authority Ethan held. Ethan took his ID back, allowing his fingers to rest for a moment on the badge, the emblem that symbolized his dedication to upholding the law and protecting people, even people like Linda, who saw him as a threat. He took a deep breath, then calmly raised his badge for those around him to see, his gaze moving slowly over the faces of the onlookers. The silence that followed was absolute. Passengers who had been watching curiously, some perhaps even believing Linda's insinuations, now looked on in stunned disbelief. There it was, unmistakable proof of Ethan's position as an FBI agent, the badge glinting in the fluorescent cabin lights. The very man Linda had accused of being a threat was, in reality, one of the country's protectors. Linda's face paled, her smug expression dissolving into a look of shock and confusion. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process what she was seeing. This was not the outcome she had envisioned, and for once, she was utterly speechless. Ethan met her gaze calmly, his voice steady as he finally addressed her directly. "Ma'am," he began, each word measured, "I understand that you had concerns about safety on this flight. As a federal agent, that's my responsibility, too. But I can assure you, you were never in danger from me." Linda's lips parted, but no words came out. She stood frozen, her gaze darting between Ethan's badge and his composed expression, unable to reconcile her assumptions with the truth staring her in the face. The confidence that had driven her actions evaporated, leaving behind only a stunned silence. Ethan continued, his voice unwavering. "In my line of work, I've seen a lot of people make judgments based on appearances. But it's rare to see someone so certain of their assumptions, especially without knowing a single fact." Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, others watching Linda with expressions ranging from disappointment to quiet disdain. The reality of her behavior was sinking in for everyone on board, and the impact of her prejudice was unmistakable. Linda, still too shocked to fully respond, managed a weak, defensive stammer. I didn't know." Ethan nodded, his tone even but pointed. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't know. And yet that didn't stop you from making accusations, treating me like a threat simply because I looked different from what you expected. It didn't matter that I was minding my own business. You decided I was guilty based on nothing but your own biases." The officers, having witnessed the exchange, took a respectful step back, now realizing that Ethan was more than capable of handling the situation. The lead officer inclined his head, silently acknowledging Ethan's authority, and leaving him to address the woman who had caused him so much trouble. Ethan took a step closer, his gaze steady on Linda's now panicked expression. "I've spent my career working to protect people, no matter who they are or what they look like," he continued. "And yes, that includes people who look different from me, who come from different backgrounds, who hold different beliefs. Because that's what real safety looks like, treating everyone with fairness and respect." The words hung in the air, each one striking a chord among the passengers. Linda, visibly flustered, shifted uncomfortably, clutching her purse as though it might provide some semblance of support. The satisfaction and smugness she displayed earlier had completely vanished, replaced by a look of pure mortification. A man seated nearby spoke up, his voice firm yet tinged with compassion. "Maybe it's time you sit down and reflect on what's just happened," he suggested, looking directly at Linda. "We all saw how you treated him. And now, well, it's clear how wrong you were." Linda's face reddened, and she glanced around, realizing that the silent judgment of the entire cabin was now on her. She looked back at Ethan, her eyes wide, as if hoping for some form of understanding or forgiveness. But Ethan's expression remained steady, a quiet strength behind his gaze. He spoke one last time, his tone unyielding but calm. Next time, before you make assumptions about someone based on how they look, maybe remember this moment. Remember that people are more than what you see on the surface. I hope you'll think twice before judging someone unfairly again." The passengers around them nodded in silent agreement, some casting sympathetic glances toward Ethan, while others turned their gaze on Linda, their disapproval clear. The quiet of the cabin was punctuated only by the faint hum of the plane, a reminder of the uncomfortable truth that had been laid bare. Linda, realizing she had nowhere to turn, muttered a barely audible apology, though the words came out stilted and hollow. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet Ethan's eyes, and stumbled slightly as she stepped back toward her seat, clearly shaken by the reality she had so long denied. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, then turned, nodding once to the officers as they moved back to the front of the plane. Linda stood frozen, her face drained of color as the realization of her mistake settled in. The silence in the cabin was almost unbearable as all eyes remained fixed on her, a collective judgment conveyed without a single word. The air seemed heavier, laden with the weight of her prejudice, now exposed and undeniable. She clutched her purse tighter, her fingers digging into the leather, as though it could somehow shield her from the humiliation washing over her. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. She struggled to find an explanation, a defense, something to erase the image of herself that had just been seared into the minds of everyone around her. But there was nothing she could say to justify what she had done. She had seen Ethan's badge, FBI, a badge of honor, integrity, and sacrifice, and it clashed so violently with the false assumptions she had clung to. A few rows back, passengers exchanged whispers, some murmuring expressions of sympathy for Ethan, others voicing quiet outrage at what they had witnessed. "Unbelievable," a woman muttered to her friend. "All that judgment, and she had no idea who he even was." Linda's face flushed, her gaze darting from one passenger to another, seeking someone, anyone, who might offer her a nod of understanding, a hint of solidarity. But all she found were expressions of disappointment, some even tinged with disgust. The confidence, the righteous anger she had wielded so freely only minutes ago, had vanished, replaced by a creeping sense of dread as she realized just how deeply she had misjudged Ethan. Ethan, meanwhile, remained calm and steady, his composed demeanor standing in stark contrast to her unraveling facade. He looked at her, not with anger, but with a quiet, resolute gaze that seemed to see through her. He didn't need to say anything more. The truth was already laid bare, and Linda was left to confront it on her own. A man seated nearby broke the silence with a low voice, his words aimed at Linda but carrying through the cabin. "Next time, maybe think twice before assuming the worst about someone you don't know." His tone was calm but carried a clear reprimand, and his words seemed to land on Linda like a weight, sinking in. Linda's lips quivered as she tried to regain her composure, but the mask she had worn throughout the flight had shattered. For the first time, she looked truly vulnerable, stripped of the arrogance that had driven her actions. She shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet the gaze of the man who had spoken, nor of Ethan, nor of anyone else around her. I didn't mean," she stammered, her voice trailing off as she realized the futility of her excuses. The words felt empty, a hollow attempt to undo the harm she had caused, but it was clear no one was willing to accept them. The flight attendant approached, her expression neutral but her tone unmistakably firm. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We're about to begin the disembarkation process." There was a finality in her voice, a subtle reminder that Linda was no longer in control, that her accusations and assumptions had not only been unfounded but exposed as a public spectacle. Linda nodded numbly, her movements robotic as she turned and stumbled back to her seat. She sank down, her gaze fixed on her lap, her face flushed with humiliation. Her earlier sense of triumph had been replaced with an acute awareness of her own prejudice, laid bare for everyone to see. As she sat, hands trembling slightly, she could feel the stares of the passengers around her, a silent, collective judgment that echoed louder than any words could. She had come into the flight believing herself above reproach, certain in her assumptions, only to be confronted with a reality she couldn't deny. And in that moment, she realized that her actions had left a mark, one that would be difficult to erase, even from her own mind. As Linda sank into her seat, avoiding the eyes around her, Ethan took a slow, calming breath. He knew he hadn't intended to say anything more, he had already said enough. But as he looked at her, sitting there in a storm of her own making, he felt compelled to leave her with a final reminder. He turned to her, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the cabin once again. "Ma'am," he began gently but firmly, "I hope you understand now that assumptions like the ones you made today can be dangerous. People are more than just what you see on the surface." Linda flinched slightly, her face still flushed with embarrassment, but she lifted her gaze to meet his, drawn by the sincerity in his words. Ethan continued, his tone resolute. "You're not just putting someone else down when you judge them unfairly, you're closing yourself off from understanding who they really are. You missed the chance to see beyond your own fears and biases." Linda's mouth opened, as if to speak, but she quickly closed it, realizing there was nothing she could say that would justify her behavior. "And next time," Ethan finished, "before you assume the worst in someone, I hope you'll remember this moment. I hope you'll remember how wrong it feels now, and how easily it could have been avoided." Linda looked away, her gaze fixed on the window, her face tight with shame. The quiet of the cabin resumed as Ethan returned his attention forward, leaving her alone with the reality of her actions and the weight of his words. A ripple of quiet agreement spread through the cabin as Ethan's words settled in. Several passengers exchanged looks, nodding silently, their expressions a mixture of respect for Ethan and disdain for Linda's behavior. Some passengers whispered to each other, their words carrying a tone of relief that someone had finally spoken the truth aloud. The young woman who had defended Ethan earlier leaned toward him, offering a small, supportive smile. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you said, and for staying calm. I don't think many people could have handled it like you did." Ethan nodded in acknowledgement, appreciating her words but maintaining his quiet composure. It wasn't the first time he'd had to confront prejudice, and he knew it likely wouldn't be the last. But seeing the support of the other passengers gave him a sense of hope, a reminder that empathy could still resonate, even in a difficult moment. Across the aisle, an older man shook his head as he looked toward Linda, a disappointed frown etched on his face. "Some people never learn," he muttered to his wife, who nodded in agreement. A few rows back, another passenger leaned forward, glancing pointedly at Linda. "Maybe this is a lesson in humility she needed," he whispered to the person beside him, his voice low but firm. "It's about time someone was held accountable for treating others this way." Linda, catching fragments of these murmured comments, shrank further into her seat, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. She avoided looking at anyone, her gaze firmly fixed on her lap, as though she could somehow erase herself from the scene. Her hands clenched tightly in her lap, and she fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable under the silent scrutiny of those around her. The flight attendant, who had observed the entire exchange, moved through the aisle one last time to ensure everyone was prepared to disembark. She offered a supportive nod to Ethan, a silent acknowledgement of the integrity he had shown. As the plane prepared for the doors to open, the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken understanding among the passengers. They knew they had witnessed something important, something beyond just a confrontation. It was a reminder of the harm caused by prejudice, and the power of standing up against it, even in silence. As the cabin doors opened and passengers began to gather their belongings, Linda sat motionless, her face a mask of humiliation and regret. She seemed almost paralyzed by the weight of everything that had transpired, the realization of her actions settling heavily on her shoulders. Passengers filed past her, some casting disapproving glances, while others simply ignored her altogether, as if she were invisible. The judgment of those around her was clear, and each step they took toward the exit only amplified her isolation. When the row finally cleared, Linda stood slowly, avoiding eye contact as she reached up to retrieve her bag. Her hands trembled as she pulled it down, the silence around her now feeling deafening. She knew that, unlike any other day, this walk through the aisle would not go unnoticed, Every step felt like a reminder of her own prejudices laid bare for all to see. Ethan had already stood nodding respectfully to a few passengers who had quietly shown their support, and as he prepared to disembark, he cast one last glance in Linda's direction. She noticed, briefly meeting his gaze, and the look in his eyes was neither anger nor disdain, but something she hadn't anticipated: pity. The realization cut deep, and Linda felt her face flush as she looked away, unable to hold his gaze any longer. A middle-aged woman in the row across from her, who had been silent for much of the flight, leaned over as Linda passed by. "Maybe this experience will teach you something," she said softly, her tone measured but unmistakably pointed. "We're all human. Judging someone based on nothing but fear and prejudice does more harm than good." The woman's words hung in the air, carrying a finality that Linda couldn't ignore. Linda managed a stiff nod, her cheeks burning as she quickened her steps, eager to escape the plane, the stairs, and the lingering judgment that surrounded her. She hoped that, by moving faster, she could somehow leave this moment behind, but she knew that wasn't true. The experience would stay with her, following her beyond the confines of the plane. As she reached the front of the cabin, the flight attendant gave her a polite but curt nod, offering no words of comfort. It was a stark contrast to the kindness she had extended to other passengers, and Linda felt the absence of that courtesy acutely. It was as if, in that silent exchange, the flight attendant was acknowledging Linda's actions for what they were, and refusing to excuse them. When Linda finally stepped off the plane, the bustling activity of the airport terminal felt overwhelming, almost surreal. People rushed by in every direction, each absorbed in their own world, yet she felt exposed, as if a spotlight was shining directly on her. For the first time, Linda was acutely aware of her own vulnerability. The thin layer of righteousness that had once shielded her now stripped away, leaving only the harsh reality of her actions. She took a deep breath, clutching her bag tightly as she walked toward the baggage claim, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't shake. She replayed the events in her head, the assumptions, the accusations, and finally Ethan's calm but powerful words. The realization was unavoidable. Her actions had been rooted not in concern, but in her own biases. And now, she would have to live with that truth. As Linda disappeared into the crowd, a few passengers who had witnessed the scene watched her go, exchanging glances that spoke of a shared understanding. They knew that, despite her outward show of pride, Linda had left that plane changed, her confidence in her own judgments shattered. What she had once viewed as vigilance, she now recognized as prejudice, and the shame of that knowledge lingered, trailing behind her like a shadow. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Ethan gathered his things, the quiet strength he displayed now a source of inspiration for those who had watched. The passengers who had stood by him or offered silent support felt a sense of closure, a reminder of the impact of integrity and dignity, even in the face of blatant bias. As Ethan walked through the terminal, he reflected on the moments that had unfolded. The journey had not just been about enduring prejudice, but also about the quiet courage it took to confront it with dignity. His calm, unshakable response had reminded everyone watching that strength is found not in loud accusations, but in the quiet resolve to remain true to oneself. For the other passengers, the incident was a lesson in empathy and the importance of standing up against judgment, whether through words or silent support. They'd seen firsthand how prejudice can warp reality, and how easily it could be shattered by simple truth. Sometimes the most powerful impact comes from small actions, a glance, a nod, a refusal to engage in hate. It's a reminder to us all to look beyond appearances and to treat others with the respect they deserve. Thank you for watching. If stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing to join a community where we value integrity, empathy, and the courage to make a difference. Stay with us for more stories that reflect life's important lessons.